Learn English through story. The Neighbor's Tree. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, two houses stood side by side, separated only by a low, ivy-covered wall. On one side lived a man named Jacob, a middle-aged, meticulous person who took great pride in his home. On the other side was Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly widow who had lived in her house for decades. She was known for her kind heart but had become physically frail with age. In the corner of Mrs. Evelyn's backyard grew a large, old oak tree. Its massive branches stretched over the wall and into Jacob's yard, casting shade over his meticulously maintained lawn. Jacob had always found the tree to be an eyesore. The falling leaves cluttered his yard, the branches blocked the sunlight he cherished, and acorns often littered his pristine grass. Though Mrs. Evelyn had always loved the tree, considering it a dear friend that had grown with her over the years, Jacob saw it only as a nuisance. One autumn afternoon, after a particularly windy day, Jacob found his yard littered with leaves and acorns once again. Frustrated, he decided he had had enough. He walked over to Mrs. Evelyn's door and knocked firmly. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing the elderly woman's gentle smile. "Hello, Jacob," she greeted him warmly. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Evelyn?" Jacob began, trying to keep his tone polite. "I've come to talk to you about the oak tree in your yard. Its branches hang over my property, and the leaves and acorns are making a mess of my lawn. I'm afraid it's becoming a real problem." Mrs. Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, and her eyes clouded with concern. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Jacob. That tree has been here since my husband and I moved in, and it means a lot to me. But I understand it might be causing you trouble." Jacob felt a twinge of guilt, but he pushed it aside. "I was hoping you might consider trimming it back, or perhaps even having it removed altogether. It's really starting to interfere with my garden, and I think it might be best for both of us." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes widened at the thought. "I'll think about it, Jacob, but it's a very old tree, and it's been a part of this home for so long. It's almost like a member of my family." Jacob nodded curtly, though he felt no satisfaction. As he walked back to his house, he couldn't help but feel that Mrs. Evelyn's attachment to the tree was sentimental and impractical. All he wanted was a clean, orderly yard, free of the tree's unwelcome presence. A few days later, a storm swept through the town, with howling winds and heavy rain. Jacob stayed indoors, listening to the storm rage outside. The next morning, he stepped outside to assess the damage, expecting the worst. To his dismay, he found that a large branch from Mrs. Evelyn's oak tree had broken off during the storm, crashing into his yard and crushing a section of his prized flower bed. Anger boiled up inside Jacob. This was the final straw. He marched over to Mrs. Evelyn's house, his frustration evident in every step. When she opened the door, he could see the weariness in her eyes, but he was too upset to notice the frailty behind her polite demeanor. "Mrs. Evelyn, this has gone too far," he exclaimed. "That tree has caused serious damage to my garden. I tried to be reasonable, but it's clear that something needs to be done about it." Mrs. Evelyn looked at Jacob with a pained expression. "I'm so sorry, Jacob," she said softly. "I didn't know the storm would cause such damage. I'll have someone come over and remove the branch right away." "That's not enough," Jacob insisted. "The tree needs to go. It's too dangerous, and it's only a matter of time before something worse happens." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time, Jacob noticed how frail and vulnerable she looked. "I understand how you feel," she said quietly. "But that tree is one of the few things I have left from my life with my husband. It's been there through everything, and I couldn't bear to lose it." Jacob was about to argue further, but something in Mrs. Evelyn's voice stopped him. He realized that, in his pursuit of perfection in his yard, he had overlooked the significance the tree held for her. It wasn't just a tree, it was a living memory, a connection to a past that she cherished. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Evelyn," Jacob said, his voice softening. "I didn't realize how much the tree meant to you. I'll have my gardener take care of the mess on my side." "You don't have to worry about it," Mrs. Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Thank you, Jacob. I know the tree is a burden for you, but it means so much to me that you understand." Over the next few months, Jacob found himself spending more time with Mrs. Evelyn. They would sit in her yard, talking about her life, her late husband, and the many memories she had shared with that old oak tree. As the seasons passed, Jacob began to see the tree not as a nuisance, but as a symbol of resilience and the passage of time. One day, as he sat under its branches with Mrs. Evelyn, he realized that the tree had become something more to him as well, a reminder that sometimes, the things we find burdensome are the very things that enrich our lives the most. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed, then please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.